just like to make the point that we're very fortunate that His Majesty has allowed us to use Buckingham Palace for this event.
There are moments in royal history that stop the world cold. Moments so seismic, so deeply personal that even the most hardened royal observers find themselves holding their breath, unable to look away. This is one of those moments. What is unfolding right now inside the walls of Buckingham Palace and behind the polished doors of Windsor Castle is not a rumor. It is not tabloid gossip dressed up as fact. According to multiple insiders with direct knowledge of the situation, King Charles III and Princess Anne have jointly authorized the release of information so explosive, so deeply destabilizing to everything the Sussex narrative has been built on that Meghan Markle's inner circle is reportedly in full crisis mode. We are talking about a bombshell that strikes at the very heart of Late Diana Mountbatten Windsor's identity. A bombshell that raises questions about birth, lineage, and legal standing that the palace has until now refused to publicly acknowledge. A bombshell that if confirmed would not just alter the Sussex story, it would rewrite it entirely. And Meghan. Sources say she is furious. Not the controlled press release kind of furious. The real kind. The kind that sends legal teams into emergency sessions at midnight and makes trusted advisors reach for their phones with shaking hands. The kind of fury that doesn't cool down after a news cycle. The kind that hardens into something permanent. So, what exactly has been dropped? Who authorized it? Why now? And what does it mean for Lily? For Harry and for a family already fractured beyond what most people thought possible. Stay with us because before this is over, everything you thought you knew about the Sussex children is going to look very different. The calm before the storm. To understand the magnitude of what King Charles and Princess Anne have set in motion, you need to understand what the palace atmosphere looked like in the weeks leading up to this revelation. By all external appearances, the royal family had been operating in what insiders describe as a managed silence. The kind of deliberate institutional quiet that Buckingham Palace has perfected over centuries. Public engagements continued. Smiles were deployed for cameras. Statements were measured, careful, and almost aggressively unremarkable. But behind that quiet, something was moving. Multiple sources with access to senior palace staff describe a period of intense internal meetings that began roughly 6 weeks before the bombshell broke. These were not routine briefings. They were described as closed-door sessions involving King Charles's most trusted advisors, Princess Anne's private secretary, the Lord High Chancellor, and a small number of legal specialists whose presence at the palace is itself considered unusual. Aides who were present described the atmosphere in those corridors as unlike anything they had experienced in years of royal service. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel like peace, the kind that feels like preparation. One palace source speaking on condition of strict anonymity put it plainly. Something had been sitting in a drawer for a long time. The question was never whether it would come out. The question was always who would authorize it to come out and when. The answer, it turns out, was Charles and Anne together. That detail alone is significant. Princess Anne, the most privately guarded member of the senior royal family, a woman who has spent decades deliberately staying out of Sussex-related controversy. Placing her name alongside King Charles's in this authorization signals something of enormous gravity. And does not move unless she is certain. She does not attach herself to controversy unless the cause in her judgment demands it. The fact that she did so here tells you everything about how seriously the palace is treating what they have uncovered. And what they have uncovered centers on Lete, Harry, and Meghan's daughter, the little girl named after the Queen herself. The question that was never supposed to be asked. Let's go back to the beginning because the thread that palace investigators have reportedly been pulling on did not start with Lete. It started with a financial irregularity, a transaction that on its surface looked almost insignificant. According to documents reviewed as part of the Royal Commission for Lineal Ethics and Continuity, which was established to examine questions of lineage and constitutional continuity within the House of Windsor, investigators noticed a payment of $499 connected to an entity identified as RQL LLC. The payment had been directed to a private U.S. medical facility known specifically for its discretion. Now, $499 is not a number that typically sets off alarm bells in a commission reviewing the financial affairs of a globally prominent royal family. But it was not the amount that triggered the deeper investigation. It was the facility, and it was the non-disclosure agreement that sources say was found connected to the same payment in the same account. The moment those two pieces of information appeared together in the same review, the commission's scope expanded rapidly. Travel timelines were examined, security logs were cross-referenced, financial data connected to earlier transactions that had already drawn attention was pulled back into the picture. And here is where the story shifts from a financial irregularity into something far more profound. The question being examined was no longer about money laundering or hidden offshore structures, though those remained under review. The question being asked quietly, carefully, and with the full weight of the Crown's legal apparatus behind it was about Leet's birth, specifically who carried her. Think about that for a moment. In the context of a royal family where lineage is not just personal history, but constitutional architecture, that question carries implications that most people outside the institution will never fully comprehend. This was not curiosity. This was the machinery of monarchy doing what it is ultimately built to do: protect the integrity of its own bloodline at any cost. What the records show and what they don't. This is the moment where most reporting on this story stops short because what comes next is not easy to write and it is not easy to read. But the palace, it appears, has decided that the time for careful navigation has passed. Sources close to the Commission's review describe a series of inconsistencies in the documented timeline surrounding Leet Diana's birth in June 2021. These inconsistencies, according to insiders, were not immediately obvious. They required forensic analysis to identify, and they involved cross-referencing multiple categories of documentation: medical records, travel manifests, financial transactions, and security logs against each other. What the forensic review reportedly found were gaps, not small gaps. Gaps that when viewed in isolation could each be explained individually. Gaps that when viewed together, according to the Commission's own internal language, were difficult to reconcile with the officially documented account. The achievements of the women of New Zealand who campaigned for their right to vote, and were the first in the world to achieve it, are universally admired. The specific nature of those gaps has not been fully disclosed publicly. The palace, true to form, is not releasing the Commission's working documents, but multiple sources describe the central area of concern as relating to Meghan's physical presence and documented movements during a critical window in the timeline leading up to and surrounding Lilibet's birth. There are also questions sources say about the private U.S. medical facility connected to the $499 RQLLC payment, about what services that facility provides, about its particular area of medical specialization, and about the specific category of non-disclosure agreement that was reportedly attached to it. The kind of NDA sources suggest that is not typically associated with routine medical procedures, and about the non-disclosure agreement connected to it. Can you feel the weight of where this is heading? Because the palace apparently can, and so can Meghan Markle's legal team. The King's decision to act. King Charles III is not a man who acts impulsively. Every person who has worked closely with him across decades of royal service describes the same characteristic. He deliberates. He consults. He weighs. He considers not just the immediate consequences of a decision, but the institutional consequences that will ripple forward years, sometimes decades into the future. The decision to authorize the release of information related to Lilibet's birth circumstances was not made quickly. Sources describe months of careful, agonized internal discussion before the king gave his approval. There were reportedly voices inside the palace arguing for continued silence. Not because the information was false, but because of the human cost of making it public. Charles, by multiple accounts, did not dismiss those voices. He listened to them. He took them seriously. He reportedly sat with the decision through multiple sleepless nights before reaching his conclusion. But in the end, sources say, he returned to a principle that has defined his approach to the monarchy since he assumed the throne. The institution cannot be built on a foundation it knows to be uncertain. Those words attributed to the king by a senior palace official carry enormous weight. That the monarchy's integrity demanded clarity whatever the personal cost. Charles's relationship with Harry remains by all accounts one of the most painful elements of his reign. The estrangement between them is not something the king has made peace with. He has not stopped loving his younger son. But love in Charles's understanding of monarchy has never been sufficient justification for institutional silence on questions of constitutional significance. Princess Anne's reasoning, according to sources close to her, runs along strikingly similar lines, and has spent her entire life in service to an institution that she believes must be honest above all else. She reportedly told one trusted confidant in the weeks before the bombshell broke, "If we look away now, we become complicit in what we looked away from." Those are not the words of a woman acting out of malice. They are the words of a woman acting out of duty, but duty, as this family has always demonstrated, can cut just as deep as cruelty. Meghan's fury, and why it matters. Let's talk about Meghan because her reaction to all of this is not simply personal drama. It is a significant indicator of how seriously her team is treating what the palace has released. Sources close to the Duchess of Sussex describe her initial response to learning that the commission had expanded its scope to include questions about Lilibet's birth as one of the most intense emotional reactions she has shown since leaving royal life. She considers her next move before fully processing her immediate emotion. This time, sources say the composure broke first. The fury that followed was described as coming in waves. There was the immediate personal reaction. The visceral shock of realizing that the institution she had spent years publicly battling had now turned its attention to her daughter, to Liette, a child. And then there was the secondary wave, arguably the more dangerous one, which was the realization of the legal exposure this could create. Because here is what Meghan's team understands with absolute clarity. The questions being raised about Liette's birth circumstances are not just personal, they are constitutional. If the Commission's findings suggest that Liette's legal parentage, as documented, does not align with biological reality, the implications extend far beyond family feelings. They extend to titles, to succession, to the birth certificates that have already listed Archie and Liette as Prince and Princess of the United Kingdom, to the Diana Trust valued at over $22 million that was placed on hold pending the Commission's conclusions. Every single one of those things is now on the table, and Meghan knows it. Her legal team, reportedly expanded in recent weeks with the addition of 2 senior constitutional law specialists, is said to be working on multiple parallel tracks simultaneously. There are privacy law arguments being prepared. There are challenges to the Commission's authority being drafted. There are, sources say, counter-documents in preparation, evidence intended to directly refute the inconsistencies the palace claims to have identified. But here is the critical question that Meghan's legal team cannot fully answer yet. What exactly has Charles and authorized the release of? Because until that full picture is known, every legal strategy they prepare risks being rendered obsolete by the next disclosure. And in this story, the next disclosure is always coming. Harry, a man caught between 2 worlds. If Meghan is furious, what is Harry? The answer, according to people close to him, is something far more complicated and far more heartbreaking than fury. Harry is by multiple accounts a man in the process of having his world restructured around him in ways he did not choose and cannot fully control. The questions being raised about Liette's birth are not just a legal crisis for him. They are a profoundly personal one. Because regardless of what the Commission ultimately concludes, Harry has raised Lilibet as his daughter. He has loved her as his daughter. He has built a life in California that centers more than most of his public narrative acknowledges, on his role as her father. The idea that the institution he grew up inside is now formally questioning the circumstances of her birth is, sources say, something Harry finds impossible to process through the frameworks he has always relied on. He cannot frame it as a media attack because this is not coming from a tabloid. He cannot frame it as jealousy or institutional spite because the people driving it are his father and his sister. The 2 senior royals with whom in the entire family Harry has maintained the most residual warmth. Sources close to Harry describe a man who has become increasingly difficult to reach in recent weeks. Not in the practical sense, but in the emotional one. Friends who have spoken to him say he is present in conversation but absent behind the eyes, as if some part of him is permanently occupied with a calculation he cannot complete. running the same numbers over and over and never arriving at a total that makes sense. A recent conversation between Harry and William was described by those aware of its contents as brief, tense, and almost unbearably careful. Both men were reported to be acutely aware that anything said between them had the potential to reach the outside world. Neither was willing to be the one who broke the careful surface of the exchange. The call lasted less than 15 minutes. Almost nothing of substance was resolved. But there was a moment, sources say, near the end of the call, when William's tone shifted, just briefly, just enough for Harry to hear beneath the institutional calm, something that sounded like grief. That moment, described by one person close to Harry as the thing he keeps coming back to, has not made the two men closer, but it has apparently made Harry less certain that what is happening is purely strategic on William's part. And in this story, uncertainty is the most dangerous thing of all. Princess Anne's role, the detail, most people are missing. Everyone is focused on King Charles, and understandably so. He is the monarch. His authorization carries the constitutional weight, but the detail that the most seasoned royal observers are focusing on is Anne. Princess Anne has for her entire adult life maintained a relationship with the press and with public controversy that can best be described as strategic invisibility. She does not give interviews. She does not release statements except on matters of direct official business. She does not allow herself to be drawn into the personal dynamics of the family's various conflicts, not publicly, not in ways that can be tracked or quoted or used. Her decision to attach her name to this authorization is therefore extraordinary. It is not something done lightly. It is not something done without full understanding of the firestorm it will ignite. Sources inside the palace describe Anne's reasoning as grounded in something she said privately to at least two senior officials in the weeks before the disclosure. She reportedly said that the monarchy's first obligation is always to truth, not to comfort, not to peace, not to the management of optics. Truth. That principle applied here carries a specific edge because the information being released does not only affect Meghan. It affects Lilibet, a child. And Anne, who has always drawn a sharp line between the obligations of adults who choose public life and the protection owed to children who have not, apparently made a deliberate judgment that in this case, the long-term protection of Leet's real interests required clarity, not continued ambiguity. What does that mean in practice? It means that Anne believes the current situation, left unresolved, would ultimately harm Lilibet more than the disclosure will. Because a child whose legal identity is built on foundations the palace knows to be uncertain is a child whose future is perpetually vulnerable. It is a child who, as she grows older, becomes increasingly exposed to the possibility of having her identity challenged at a moment she is least prepared to face it. And in the view of those closest to her, decided that a difficult truth now is always preferable to a devastating truth later. Whether Meghan sees it that way is another matter entirely. The Diana Trust, the financial stakes nobody can ignore. Let's return to the money because in this story, as in so many royal stories, the financial threads are inseparable from the personal ones. Princess Diana's discretionary trust, valued at over $22 million, was specifically structured to pass through her sons to future generations. The grandchildren she never got to meet, the children she would have adored, the children whose faces she would have memorized, whose names she would have whispered with the kind of joy only grandmothers understand. That trust had already been placed on hold by Prince William pending the Commission's conclusions. That pause, described by palace officials as temporary and precautionary rather than punitive, sent a message of enormous clarity about how seriously the palace was taking the Commission's work. But now, with King Charles and Princess Anne having authorized the release of bombshell information relating to Leet's birth circumstances, the question of the trust has entered an entirely new phase. Because the trust's distribution is tied directly to the legal standing of Diana's grandchildren, and legal standing is tied directly to the questions the Commission is now formally raising. If Leet's birth circumstances, as documented, cannot be fully verified by the Commission's review, what does that mean for her status as a beneficiary of Diana's estate? What does it mean for her title? What does it mean for her place in the family that her grandmother gave her name to honor? Harry's reported reaction to the trust being paused was described by sources as going beyond frustration into grief. The trust was not just money to Harry. It was his mother's legacy. The one tangible connection between Diana and the grandchildren she never knew. The idea of that connection being suspended, even temporarily, was described as a wound that went deeper than any institutional dispute. Now, with the stakes around the trust even higher, sources say Harry is struggling to hold the personal and the constitutional dimensions of this situation separately. They keep collapsing into each other, and every time they do, the grief gets heavier. The arrival that changed everything. You need to know about the plane. In the early hours of a cold London morning, a leaked travel manifest appeared online. A Gulfstream G650, tail number ending in 722 SWID, had filed for arrival at RAF Northolt, not Heathrow, where media crews had been positioned through the night, waiting for something they could not name but knew was coming. RAF Northolt, a military airfield used for arrivals that require security, precision, and a controlled environment. The manifest listed one adult male under the name Henry Mountbatten Windsor, traveling with two young dependents, Archie and Leet, who had not been seen on British soil since the Platinum Jubilee in 2022, were coming home. Meghan's name was not on the manifest. 3 black Range Rovers were positioned near the runway. 2 senior royal officials were waiting. Their presence made it immediately clear that this was not a casual family visit. This had been coordinated at the highest institutional level. When the cabin door opened and Harry stepped out, his face carried the visible weight of everything that had been placed on him in the preceding months. He did not wave. He did not perform. He took one step forward, then turned back toward the aircraft. And then Archie and Lilibet appeared at the top of the steps. Think about that image for a moment. Really think about it. 2 small children stepping off a plane onto British soil, holding their father's hands, coming down the steps one at a time into the grey London morning air in the middle of an institutional crisis that questioned among other things the very nature of Leet's identity. Whatever documents the Commission had reviewed, whatever the forensic accountants had found, whatever arguments were being prepared on both sides of the legal divide, none of it could prepare anyone who watched that moment for what it actually felt like to see those 2 children arrive. It was a human moment inside an institutional war. And it reminded every person watching that at the center of this story, beneath all the legal filings and palace statements and leaked manifests and forensic reviews, there are children, real children, with their own futures and their own identities and their own right to be loved without condition. Doesn't that change how you feel about all of this? It should. 2 possible futures and the question nobody can answer. The Commission is preparing its conclusions. The final report, according to sources, is in the hands of 3 individuals, Prince William, Princess Anne, and the Lord High Chancellor. The decision they are about to make is being described by those inside and outside the palace as one of the most consequential the House of Windsor has faced in the modern era. 2 possible outcomes, 2 entirely different futures. If the Commission rules in a direction that fully acknowledges and validates the documented birth circumstances of Lilibet Diana Mountbatten Windsor, the bombshell released by Charles and Anne will be recontextualized. It will be framed as the palace having examined the questions raised and found them resolved. The Diana Trust will be unfrozen. The titles will remain intact and the Sussex family, wounded and exhausted, will be left to rebuild whatever relationship with the institution is still possible. It would be read by many as the monarchy choosing family over constitutional precision, as the institution deciding that the human cost of continued investigation outweighed the institutional cost of unresolved questions. It would also represent, in the view of some observers, the most significant act of grace the modern royal family has managed in years, a signal that even fractured institutions can choose repair over rupture. But if the Commission rules in the other direction, if it formally concludes that the inconsistencies identified in its review cannot be reconciled with the official documented account of Lilibet's birth, then the implications are seismic. Titles could be formally suspended. Legal standing could be challenged in open court. The Diana Trust would remain in limbo, potentially permanently, and the separation between the Sussex family and the House of Windsor would shift from the uncomfortable, unofficial distance of the past several years into something formal, something permanent, something that no future reconciliation gesture could simply undo. Harry's children would grow up in California without the royal standing their father was born into, without the financial legacy their grandmother left for them, without the institutional belonging that, whatever its cost connects them to a history and a family that is also theirs. And the two brothers, they would be left further apart than at any point since Harry first said he wanted to leave. What this means for Meghan's title fight. Remember the title because it matters here too. Meghan has already been, according to multiple sources, actively consulting with constitutional law specialists about protecting her Duchess of Sussex title against any future attempt by Prince William to remove it once he assumes the throne. King Charles's stripping of Prince Andrew's titles in October 2025 established a precedent that Meghan's team is acutely aware of. Now, with the bombshell about Lilibet's birth circumstances sitting on top of that existing anxiety, the title question has taken on a new and more urgent dimension. Because if the Commission concludes that there are unresolved questions about Lilibet's birth, the legal exposure for Meghan does not stop with Lilibet's title or the Diana Trust, it potentially extends to Meghan's own standing within the royal framework. The precedent for stripping titles has already been set. The appetite for institutional clarity has already been demonstrated, and the people driving this process, Charles and Anne, have shown that they are willing to absorb the personal and public cost of doing what they believe the institution requires. Meghan's team knows this. That is part of why the fury, according to sources, has not dissipated. It has deepened because with every passing day the scope of the potential exposure grows wider. She is by all accounts fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. The birth circumstances question, the title question, the trust question, the legal strategy to challenge the Commission's authority, and underneath all of it, the personal reality of being a mother whose daughter's identity is at the center of an institutional war. Those close to Meghan describe a woman who is outwardly composed in public appearances, but operating at an internal intensity that those around her have rarely witnessed. The stakes have never been higher. The enemies, if she views them that way, have never been more powerful. And the battlefield, which once felt like the tabloid press and social media commentary, has now moved into constitutional territory, where her Hollywood instincts and her media strategy carry far less weight than the documents being reviewed behind palace walls. That is an enormous amount for any person to carry. Whatever you think of Meghan Markle, whatever position you have taken in the years-long debate over her place in the royal story, it is worth pausing to acknowledge that the question the palace cannot answer, and neither can we. Here is the honest truth about where this story stands right now. King Charles and Princess Anne have authorized the release of information that raises fundamental questions about the birth circumstances of Lily Diana Mountbatten Windsor. The Royal Commission for Lineal Ethics and Continuity is deep in its review of those questions.